three engineers laughed when Caleb Rowan set 3 bolts on the testing table. They called his solution a garage repair trick, dismissed him as a maintenance worker with no business being in the room, and had him escorted out before the international client arrived. 11 minutes later, the Aegis H9 turbine shook violently during the billion-dollar demonstration, and Ashcroft Dynamics watched its most important contract begin to collapse. Every credentialed engineer reached for a keyboard and found nothing they could fix. When the silence became unbearable, Caleb walked back through the door, held those same 3 bolts up, and said, "You have 7 minutes to trust me. Subscribe now, because 3 ordinary bolts are about to dismantle an entire room full of the most arrogant people in the building." The Nevada testing facility ran on a hierarchy so fixed that even the air felt sorted by clearance level, with engineers occupying the upper floors and technicians like Caleb Rowan occupying the corridors below, passing each other in the morning without much acknowledgement in either direction. Caleb had spent 9 years inside that structure, learning its unspoken rules. And he had come to understand that those rules were not primarily about safety or competence, but about who was allowed to have an opinion that mattered. He arrived at the Aegis H9 test bay 2 full hours ahead of the engineering team on the morning before the demonstration, carrying a flashlight, a toolbox he had owned since before his daughter was born, and a spiral notebook containing 4 months of handwritten vibration readings gathered from his own observations during routine maintenance shifts. Every number in it had been recorded at the machine itself on the floor of the bay, where the readings reflected what the turbine was actually doing rather than what a filtered display was designed to show. He moved through the pre-dawn, quiet removing access panels methodically, and directing his light along bearing surfaces and mounting brackets, listening in the way that 17 years of turbine work had made second nature, not for the sounds that triggered alarms, but for the sounds that came before alarms existed to describe them. What he heard was a single dry impact, no longer than a half-second, occurring at the tail end of each heat-up cycle, with the regularity of a mechanical event rather than electrical interference, and it was a sound he recognized from a generating station in West Texas, where a control ring had been shifting inside its housing during thermal cycles, until the day it drifted far enough to send the sensor package a reading it could not survive. He removed the forward access cover from the turbine's primary bearing assembly and directed his flashlight along the inner edge of the control ring collar, examining the surface at close range with the kind of attention that required stillness more than speed. The friction trace was barely visible without magnification, a thin arc of burnished metal along the inner face of the mounting bracket, the kind of mark that appeared when 2 surfaces, not supposed to move against each other, had been doing so long enough to leave a record. He measured the lateral offset of the ring using the caliper from his chest pocket and read a value of 1.8 millimeters, which was close enough to 2 that the distinction no longer carried any practical weight because the thermal threshold scheduled for that afternoon's load test would push the displacement well past the point where the casing could hold the ring in place. He climbed to the 2nd floor and found Lena Whitaker at her monitoring station before she had finished her first coffee of the morning. And he set the notebook open in front of her and stood back while she read through the data without prompting. Lena was the program's quality assurance engineer and the only person in the Aegis management structure who had ever responded to one of his written observations with a follow-up question rather than a brief acknowledgement and silence, and she read his numbers the way they deserved to be read, without deciding what they meant before she finished them. When she looked up, her expression confirmed the data was not ambiguous, but her next sentence told him that Dr. Bryce Halden had issued a standing directive restricting all design modifications within 24 hours of the demonstration window, a directive she had no authority to override. Caleb told her the fix did not require a redesign in any meaningful sense. Only 3 heat-rated bolts and a triangular brace he had already fabricated from certified alloy stock, installed at 3 existing manufacturer-approved service points built into the turbine body as part of the original assembly specification. Lena asked him how long he had been tracking the ring displacement, and he turned the notebook to the first entry in that section and showed her the date written at the top of the page. 4 months and 11 days before the morning they were standing together in the dim light of the monitoring station. She opened the reporting archive and searched for his name, and the report appeared with its original timestamp and its complete contents: the photographs of the friction trace, the offset measurements, the thermal cycle data, and the annotated brace drawings with material certification numbers for each component. The record showed the report had been opened on the day it was submitted, reviewed within the hour, and marked with a single status designation: reviewed, no corrective action required. The name attached to that determination was Bryce Halden's. The final technical briefing before the demonstration was scheduled to last 45 minutes and serve as a formal confirmation that the decisions had already been made. The meeting itself a ceremony rather than a deliberation. Caleb entered the conference room carrying the fabricated brace in one hand and 3 bolts in his shirt pocket, knowing the room would not receive what he was about to present, but understanding that he was going to present it anyway, because the alternative was to watch the afternoon happen exactly as he expected it would. The people assembled around the table included Bryce Halden at the head, Grant Sloan positioned to his left in the seat that communicated second highest authority, 3 design engineers who had worked directly under Bryce for the duration of the program, and 2 program office managers whose primary function in most meetings was to reinforce whatever consensus the most senior engineer in the room had already decided to reach. Caleb waited for the first break in the agenda, set the brace and the 3 bolts on the table without ceremony, and delivered his report in approximately 2 minutes: the friction trace, the offset measurement, the thermal expansion timeline he had documented across 4 months, and the specific sequence by which the control ring would continue to rotate past the point of sensor accuracy once the turbine crossed the thermal threshold scheduled for the afternoon run. Bryce did not ask a single question about the measurements. He looked at the maintenance uniform Caleb was wearing, then at the brace lying on the polished table, and asked in a tone that carried just enough formality to pass as professional whether Caleb understood that design authority for the AGITS program was a function assigned to credentialed members of the engineering team and not to the facilities maintenance department. Grant Sloan picked up one of the bolts between 2 fingers, held it up toward the fluorescent panels overhead, and announced that no responsible program manager would allow a billion-dollar demonstration to rest on what he described as a $3 repair from somebody's garage toolkit. And the 2 design engineers exchanged a look and said nothing, which was a kind of participation in its own right. Caleb explained that the value of a mechanical intervention was not a function of its component costs, but of the geometry of its load path, the thermal coefficient of the alloy, and the differential torque values he had calculated for each of the 3 installation positions based on the measured heat distribution in that section of the casing, and he laid the photographs of the friction trace and the offset printouts on the table and invited anyone present to examine them. He watched Bryce glance at the photographs for a few seconds and declare them consistent with ordinary thermal surface contact rather than evidence of a developing mechanical failure. Bryce then asked Caleb, with the deliberateness of someone who has chosen a weapon in advance, which engineering institution he had graduated from, and when Caleb did not answer immediately, Bryce answered on his behalf by noting that Ashcroft Dynamics had not built its technical reputation on the intuitions of individuals who had not completed a degree program, and that the company's obligation to its contracting partner required solutions backed by documented credentials rather than a notebook full of handwritten field observations. Grant added that Caleb's access badge would be restricted to the maintenance wing for the duration of the demonstration, framing this as a procedural safeguard. Victoria Ashcroft appeared in the doorway as the exchange was concluding, catching only Bryce's summary and the murmur of agreement that followed it. And when Caleb attempted to address her, she turned to Bryce and asked whether the system was fully prepared for the afternoon schedule. Bryce said it was, without qualification of any kind, and Victoria told the room to proceed and walked out, taking with her the only authority that might have changed what was about to happen. Caleb gathered the brace and the bolts from the table, and was nearly through the door when Bryce's voice followed him, loud enough for everyone remaining to hear, "Tomorrow, let the engineers save the contract. Your job is to make sure the floor is clean after we're finished." Conrad Blackwell arrived at the Nevada facility on the morning of the demonstration in a manner that communicated, without requiring any statement, that he had not come to be impressed but to assess. And the distinction was one that Grant Sloan's entire preparation for the day had been designed to obscure. The Blackwell Gridworks organization had spent 3 years building toward a procurement agreement that would place more than 100 hydrogen turbine units into the backup power infrastructure of 9 states, and the total value approaching $1 billion represented a bet on the technical maturity of a technology not yet proven at scale in continuous field operation. Conrad had learned over many large transactions that the quality of information available at the moment of commitment mattered more than any other characteristic of the thing being committed to. He shook Grant's hand at the facility entrance, declined the offered tour narrative, and spent 20 minutes walking the floor in silence with his own inspection team while Grant followed and offered context that no one appeared to be requesting. The demonstration area had been arranged with attention to the visual language of confidence. Corporate identification along the upper wall, a bank of live data displays facing the observation seating, cameras positioned to emphasize the turbine scale from its most favorable angle. Bryce opened the formal presentation with a review of the program's computational modeling history, its thermal efficiency specifications, and the cumulative hours of simulation testing the system had completed, moving through the prepared material with the fluency of someone who had delivered it enough times to have stopped hearing it. Conrad listened without visible response until Bryce reached a phrase about simulation accuracy, and then he asked a single question. How many hours had the turbine operated under actual thermal load in a live facility environment? The answer, once Bryce finished constructing it, resolved to fewer than 40 hours, which was not the response a presentation built around 12,000 simulated hours had been designed to lead toward, and Conrad noted this in silence, which was more unsettling to the people watching him than any objection would have been. Caleb was not present for any of this. He had been assigned to a parts storage room 2 corridors from the main bay, given a clipboard and an inventory checklist, and told that his task for the afternoon was to verify component counts, work that could have been completed by anyone on the maintenance crew. He worked through the list without complaint, tracking the turbine's progress through sound and vibration the way he always tracked it, feeling the building around him transmit information through the concrete floor in frequencies that were not audible so much as physical, the way certain truths made themselves known not through language, but through the body's quiet insistence that something was not right. His daughter called once, briefly, and he told her the afternoon test was moving forward and that he was doing his part of it, which was the most accurate version of the answer available to him at that moment. He checked the time after the call ended, calculated the turbine's estimated heat-up rate against the threshold he had been tracking for 4 months, and turned the 3 bolts over in his pocket with his thumb. In the monitoring room, Lena Whitaker was watching 2 versions of the same data simultaneously. The raw vibration feed that showed what the machine was actually doing, and the filtered presentation overlay that showed what the client was intended to see. And the gap between them was growing in a specific frequency band that she recognized from the notebook Caleb had placed in front of her that morning. She reported this to Bryce, who told her the filter was a standard adjustment to remove electrical interference from the display chain, and that her role during the demonstration was to support the program's presentation integrity and not to raise technical objections in a client-facing environment. Lena told him that what she was seeing was not electrical in character, that its signature matched mechanical surface contact rather than electromagnetic noise, and that she was not comfortable applying the overlay without registering the observation formally. Bryce told her she was welcome to file a technical note after the demonstration concluded and walked away. At 70% of rated capacity, nothing on any screen showed a fault, and the people in the observation area began to carry themselves with the looseness of people who have decided the difficult part is finished. 2 corridors away, Caleb felt the building's rhythm shift by a fraction. No instrument had been calibrated to detect at that level of subtlety, and he took the 3 bolts out of his pocket and closed his fingers around them. The protective shutdown initiated at 82% of rated capacity, triggered by a control ring that had moved less than 2 millimeters from its certified position, precisely what Caleb had described in a report submitted 4 months earlier and closed without response within the same business day. The ring's lateral displacement sent the adjacent speed sensor a data signal that corresponded, within the sensor's interpretation logic, to a turbine entering uncontrolled acceleration, and the system did exactly what it had been designed to do. It closed the fuel valve, shed the load, and brought everything to a full stop in under 9 seconds, which was a successful safety outcome and a catastrophic demonstration outcome simultaneously. The silence that followed the shutdown filled the observation area with the awareness of what had been lost in those 9 seconds, the credibility of the system, the confidence of the client, and the buffer of time that no amount of explanation would restore. Conrad Blackwell asked for the cause of the shutdown with the measured precision of someone who expected the first answer he received to be incomplete. Bryce told the room it was a sensor calibration anomaly, a software artifact the engineering team could resolve within 10 minutes, and delivered this assessment with a steadiness that would have been persuasive in a different room. But Conrad's inspection engineers had been taking their own notes throughout the demonstration, and those notes were not going to cooperate with the software anomaly narrative. A diagnostic sweep returned no software errors. A restart attempt failed at the initialization self-check because the safety verification routine detected the control ring was still offset and refused to advance through the startup sequence. And a second attempt failed for the same reason, after which the gap between what Bryce was saying and what the data was showing became wide enough that even the program office managers stopped nodding along. Grant moved through the observation area, speaking to each manager individually and framing the situation as a demonstration of the system's extraordinary safety sensitivity, an argument that was technically defensible and strategically incoherent because a client purchasing turbines for a 9-state power infrastructure was not going to be reassured by the knowledge that those turbines would shut themselves down under conditions Ashcroft's own engineering team was unable to explain on the day of the sales demonstration. Conrad informed Grant that his organization's schedule required him to leave the facility within 30 minutes if the turbine did not complete a successful load cycle, and that the contract gave Blackwell Gridworks the right to withdraw if the demonstration did not conclude within the established window. He was not raising his voice. He was reading the terms of an agreement both parties had already signed. Bryce ordered the primary speed sensor replaced, which took 8 minutes, and when the new sensor returned an identical reading because the problem was the ring and not the sensor, he began a third explanation that was not substantively different from the first two. Lena said, quietly, that there was a technician in the facility who had predicted the specific failure mechanism currently preventing the restart, whose written report included the precise offset measurement and the thermal threshold at which the ring would shift, and that the report had been filed 4 months earlier and closed without action. Victoria Ashcroft stepped forward and asked Lena to repeat what she had just said. Lena repeated it in full, including the detail about the report's closure status. Bryce stated the report had been reviewed and found to be based on a misinterpretation of normal wear data by someone without the engineering background to distinguish mechanical noise from structural deformation. Conrad turned from the display to the center of the room and asked the question that no one was prepared for. "Someone predicted this failure and you sent him out of the building?" No one answered. Conrad looked at his watch. 21 minutes remained. Victoria did not ask Grant to find Caleb, and she did not suggest it. She issued a direct instruction using his full name, and she said at once. Grant arrived at the storage room to find Caleb seated on a metal stool with a parts list on a clipboard, working through inventory numbers with the unhurried focus of someone who had been given a task and was completing it. He told Caleb there was a maintenance concern with the Aegis system that required immediate attention and that he needed to come right now, framing the request in the tone of someone accustomed to issuing assignments rather than making appeals, which was a significant miscalculation given the circumstances. Caleb set down the clipboard and asked Grant to state clearly, in front of the two other technicians present in the room, that the system failure was the result of a mechanical design characteristic in the control ring mounting assembly and not an error in maintenance operations or technician conduct. Grant told him the cause would be addressed through the appropriate debrief process and that the immediate priority was resolution rather than attribution. A response that meant no. Caleb remained on the stool and said that if the company's position was that he was being terminated, he would collect his personal items and leave immediately, and that no one currently in the building would have access to the specific differential torque calculations he had developed for the 3-bolt installation positions, values that had never been submitted to any company document and could not be recovered from any archive. He was not making a threat. He was providing accurate information about the practical consequences of the decision Grant appeared to be moving toward. Victoria came to the storage room herself, which communicated more than anything she said when she arrived, because it meant the chain of delegation had reached its end, and the person at the top of it had decided to operate without intermediaries. She did not offer an apology, but she asked Caleb directly whether he could stabilize the control ring assembly within the time remaining on the demonstration window, and the question itself was a form of acknowledgement that what he had been saying all morning was accurate. He told her he could do it in the available time, and that he would not touch the turbine without a written authorization document naming him as the proposing technician and reflecting explicit approval from the company's chief executive, because he needed that record to be permanent and non-revisable in a form that could not be attributed to someone else after the fact if the people who had dismissed him decided they wanted ownership of the outcome. Victoria turned to Lena, who had followed her from the control room, and told her to generate an emergency technical deviation notice with Caleb's name on it immediately. Bryce intercepted them before they reached the bay and told Victoria that authorizing an uncredentialed technician to modify a certified assembly in front of a client and an independent inspection team was the single most effective way to undermine every claim Ashcroft had made about the program's technical rigor, and that the reputational cost would exceed any benefit from a successful restart. Victoria asked if he had a working alternative to propose. He said he needed more time to complete a proper diagnostic. She asked how much time. He could not give her a number. She walked past him. At the turbine, Caleb showed the inspection team's lead engineer the friction trace on the inner surface of the mounting bracket, and the engineer examined it for 40 seconds and confirmed the contact pattern was consistent with rotational displacement under thermal load. Not Caleb's interpretation of the evidence, but an independent confirmation of it. He identified the 3 manufacturer-certified service ports, where the brace would be seated, explained to the assembled engineers and inspectors why each bolt position required a different torque value based on the asymmetric temperature gradient in that section of the casing, and described what would occur if all 3 positions were tightened to a uniform specification. The brace would resist the thermal expansion unevenly, create a secondary rotational load, and push the ring in the opposite direction from where it had already drifted. He seated the triangular brace, drove the first 2 bolts to their designated torque values without hesitation, and was positioning the third when Bryce said from the service corridor doorway that the installation should be halted until the simulation team had modeled the effect on the system's resonance behavior. Caleb set the torque wrench down, looked at Bryce, and said, "You had 3 months to run simulations. I have 7 minutes to fix what you chose not to see." He picked the wrench back up. Victoria told the room to proceed with the restart. The turbine's restart initialization took 4 minutes and 12 seconds, while the control room stood in a silence, less about decorum and more about the collective awareness that the next several minutes would determine whether the afternoon ended as a recovery or as a final collapse, and almost no one moved unnecessarily during those 4 minutes, because stillness felt like the only form of participation available to people who had no useful role in what was happening. Conrad Blackwell stood near the primary data display, watching the initialization sequence without the engagement of someone hoping for success and without the withdrawal of someone prepared to accept failure. Simply watching, the way a person watches when they have decided that their response will be proportionate to the actual outcome rather than to their preference about it. Grant checked his watch at intervals he was unable to control. Victoria stood behind the main console with her attention fixed on the vibration channel, which was the channel that was going to tell the story before any other indicator did. The system reached 40% of rated capacity without any sensor alarm and continued climbing, and Bryce, positioned at a workstation near the back wall, had predicted in a voice quiet enough that only the engineer beside him could hear that the brace installation would introduce a resonance interaction before the first 2 minutes of load were complete. The 2 minutes passed without the predicted distortion, and Bryce recalibrated his forecast without announcing the revision, which had been characteristic of his engagement with disconfirming evidence throughout the program. 50% came and went, 60 arrived, and the system crossed it without the vibration signature that had preceded the original shutdown making any reappearance. The control ring holding its position as the casing expanded around it, and the 3 bolt positions distributing the thermal expansion load along the brace geometry in exactly the asymmetric pattern that Caleb had calculated to prevent the rotational loading that had initiated the failure sequence. Caleb was not in the control room. He had been placed at the secondary observation window where he could see the instrument feeds without being visible to the client, and he stood there monitoring 3 specific values: bearing housing temperature, sensor phase offset, and lateral vibration frequency. Watching with the focused steadiness of someone who had been tracking those 3 numbers for 4 months and understood what each of them should be doing at every stage of the load curve. At 75% capacity, a single dry impact sound moved through the structure, identical in character to the sound he had identified that morning in the empty bay, lasting less than a second, and Grant announced through the intercom that the fix had clearly failed. Caleb asked the control room to hold the load steady at 75% and make no adjustment to the throttle in either direction, because he had anticipated this specific event. The third bolt, at its initial torque setting, had not fully compensated for the dimensional change in the alloy after the metal reached operating temperature, and the solution was a quarter turn of additional torque applied from the exterior access fitting on the service corridor, a procedure explicitly covered under the facility's operational adjustment protocol, which permitted peripheral calibration on active systems without requiring the protective casing to be opened. Conrad's lead inspector confirmed, after checking the protocol document, that the adjustment was within permitted procedure. Bryce objected that modifying an active assembly was contrary to sound engineering practice, and the inspector told him the protocol document said otherwise, and that the document was the same one Ashcroft had submitted as part of the facility certification package. Caleb made the quarter-turn adjustment, and the lateral vibration frequency returned to its baseline value. Within 8 seconds, the sensor phase offset held within the tolerance band established from months of baseline observation, and the 3 bearing housing temperatures continued their expected rise without acceleration or asymmetry, suggesting the brace was failing under load. The turbine climbed through 80% and through 82%, the threshold where the control ring had shifted in the original sequence, and the ring did not move. Conrad stepped closer to the primary display. The system reached 90%, then 95%, then the full rated capacity, arriving there without triggering any protective response and without any mechanical indication of distress. And the final test requirement began: a sustained hold at full load for 3 consecutive minutes with no interruptions. During those 3 minutes, Bryce made 3 separate requests for thermal camera reviews of the brace installation, and each review returned images showing the heat distribution following exactly the asymmetric pattern Caleb had specified, dispersing through the brace material without concentrating at any single point, without approaching the alloy's rated thermal limit. Near the end of the 3rd minute, Lena watched Bryce's hand move toward the filter override control on his own workstation and reached her own terminal first, engaging the administrative lock function under her credentials and closing his access to the display parameters. He looked at her. She did not look away. The 3-minute hold completed. Conrad told his inspection team to note that the load cycle had been completed within the demonstration window, and then he turned to the room and asked, with the precision of someone who has been composing a question carefully, who had first identified the failure mechanism and filed a written notice of the associated risk. Grant began an explanation about integrated team reporting processes and collaborative diagnostic workflows. Conrad waited. Then he asked the question again. The official account that Grant eventually produced described the Aegis program's safety reporting architecture as a multi-layered team process in which observations from all levels of the organization were reviewed and addressed through structured engineering channels, and it was exactly the kind of sentence that sounded authoritative while containing no information that could be evaluated against anything specific. Conrad responded by requesting access to the original documentation with submission timestamps reviewer identities, and the complete modification history attached to the file. And when Bryce stated that the documentation contained proprietary engineering data whose release to an external party required a formal review process, taking several business days, Conrad said he would not execute a binding agreement with an organization unable to explain the cause of a safety shutdown that had occurred in front of his inspection team, and that the business day's timeline was not compatible with his schedule or his patience. Victoria told Lena to open the archive. The file appeared with its original timestamp from 4 months prior, its contents intact. The photographs of the friction trace, the calibrated offset measurements, the thermal cycle data from 4 months of manual observation, and the dimensioned brace sketch, with the differential torque specification for each of the 3 installation positions, along with the materials certification reference for the alloy stock and a notation that the service ports were pre-existing features in the original manufacturer's assembly specification. The record showed the file had been opened by Bryce Halden on the day it was submitted and marked closed within hours, with the designation, reviewed, no corrective action required. 7 days after that closure, a design note had been added to the Aegis program archive under Bryce's authorship referencing the theoretical possibility of mounting bracket torsional stress under extended thermal load conditions, and Caleb's name did not appear in it anywhere. Lena then produced the raw vibration data from the period preceding the demonstration window, and the difference between the unfiltered feed and the overlay that had been displayed to everyone in the room was not a matter of interpretation. The raw data showed the lateral frequency signature building at a rate that, projected forward, predicted the control ring event within a few minutes of when it had actually occurred, while the filtered version showed a flat and unremarkable baseline that communicated nothing of concern to anyone relying on it. Grant characterized the filtering as routine noise reduction practice standard to all client-facing technical presentations, and Conrad told him that the distinction between simplification and concealment was not a technical judgment but an ethical one, and that in this case the answer was recorded in the modification log with timestamps attached to Bryce's administrative credentials. Bryce pivoted to a statement about the difficulty of maintaining program momentum when individual contributors introduced uncertainty into time-critical decisions without the credentials or the institutional standing to validate their own assessments, a statement clearly organized around Caleb's position in the company rather than the content of his analysis, which was a meaningful choice given that the content of the analysis had just been confirmed as accurate by the failure sequence both of them had watched occur. Caleb produced his phone and read the subject lines of the emails he had sent to Bryce, Grant, Lena, and the facility safety coordinator across the preceding 4 months, then displayed the delivery confirmation for the physical brace sample, sent to the engineering department 8 weeks before the demonstration, and returned with a handwritten notation indicating it was unsolicited and outside the approved design submission process. Victoria understood in that moment that the failure was not a gap in the warning system. The warning had arrived, been received, and been closed by someone who had more to lose from acknowledging it than from ignoring it. And she had not known this was happening because she had trusted the framing of the people closest to the program, rather than asking to see the underlying evidence. Conrad told the room that the contract remained technically valid, but that final execution would be suspended pending an independent review of the program's safety data management practices, which transformed the recovered demonstration into a contingent outcome rather than a settled one. Victoria offered Caleb a substantial financial settlement and an expanded confidentiality provision in exchange for a public incident account describing the shutdown as a routine sensor calibration event resolved through normal engineering procedure. and Caleb declined without deliberation. The issue was never the 3 bolts, he said, and never had been. The issue was that a person who knew a machine was not ready for a live demonstration had allowed it to proceed anyway, because stopping it would have required admitting that the design had a problem, and the cost of that admission had been calculated as higher than the cost of the risk transferred to everyone in the building that afternoon. Victoria warned him that a full public accounting could put thousands of employees at risk for decisions they had not made. Caleb said, "It isn't the truth that puts those people at risk. It's the decision you made to let a lie get close enough to the production line to threaten them." The independent investigation was commissioned within 48 hours, not entirely a voluntary act. Victoria understood that Conrad would initiate his own review if she declined, and that a review initiated by the client would have access to everything her own review might choose not to examine. She contracted an external technical review firm with no prior relationship to Ashcroft and authorized Lena to provide full documentation access without filtering through the program office, which was a significant departure from the company's standard third-party engagement protocol and communicated something about how seriously Victoria was taking the obligation to produce an accurate result. Bryce's system access was suspended by the end of the first day. Grant continued operating through the administrative channels available to him, approaching board members individually with a narrative framing the demonstration as an ultimately successful event, whose brief interruption was attributable to a discrete sensor component and not to any pattern of judgment or conduct that should concern the organization's leadership. He was working on the 3rd version of this narrative when the investigators asked to speak with him. Caleb participated in the reconstruction process as a technical resource, presenting the sequence of events in chronological order using the notebook, the email archive, the materials certifications, and the brace design drawings with their original dates, doing so without editorializing or emphasis, which made the account more credible rather than less, because it required no dramatic framing to produce a clear picture of what had occurred. He did not use the sessions as an opportunity to assign failure to the engineers who had laughed at him in the conference room. He described what each person had done and when, using documentation where it existed and his own direct observation where it did not, and the investigators found the account consistent across every point where it could be verified against an external record. The findings required no interpretation because the documentation was sufficiently complete to remove interpretation as a necessary step. Bryce had received the warning. He had known the ring displacement mechanism was plausible, and the evidence was in his own amended design note, filed under his credentials 7 days after he closed Caleb's report, which referenced the same failure mechanism in language tracking Caleb's analysis closely enough that the derivation was not deniable. The decision not to redesign or delay had been made because the redesign timeline would have pushed the demonstration back by 6 weeks, and the program schedule was connected by contract to a performance incentive payment whose timing both Bryce and Grant had reason to protect. The vibration data filtering had been applied in a manner making the developing anomaly invisible to every person in the management chain, reviewing summary-level reports rather than raw feeds. And Caleb's name had been removed from an internal technical addendum that characterized the 3-bolt brace concept as a maintenance-level observation noted by the program team without attribution to its origin. Lena testified that she had observed the developing vibration signature and been directed to apply the filter rather than log the anomaly, and that she had understood at the time that formally raising the issue would have placed her standing within the program at substantial risk, and that she had made a choice she was no longer able to defend. Caleb said nothing to assign blame to her, but he said, in the presence of the investigation team, that a system which made silence safer than disclosure for the people closest to the evidence was a system that would generate the same outcome regardless of who happened to be standing next to the machine when the cycle completed. Grant proposed in a closed session that terminating both Bryce and Caleb from the program would present the company as having handled the matter even-handedly, and Conrad joined the session through a remote connection that had not been announced, told the board that Blackwell Gridworks would withdraw from the agreement immediately if Caleb Rowan was terminated or assigned any portion of the responsibility for the demonstration shutdown, and said that he did not require his partners to be organizations that never made mistakes. He required them to be organizations that could identify which person had seen the mistake coming and demonstrate the institutional capacity to listen to that person the next time. The resolution session was held in the Ashcroft boardroom with the investigators, the board's audit committee, the full program leadership group, and Conrad's legal representatives present, and Bryce arrived with his own attorney and a prepared statement delivered in the tone of a person who has rehearsed an argument to the point of having stopped testing it against the possibility that it might not be persuasive. He maintained through the first portion of the session that his data management decisions had been reasonable exercises of engineering program authority, that the demonstration had ultimately succeeded through an improvised intervention that happened to work under specific conditions, and that a temporary brace fabricated outside the design process and installed under time pressure should not be treated as a technical contribution that changed the nature of the program or its attribution. Caleb, when his turn came, agreed with Bryce about one thing. The brace was a temporary stabilization measure. He had described it as one from the beginning, and he had never characterized it otherwise. The statement appeared to give Bryce a moment of relief, and then Caleb produced a document that had not been part of any prior presentation, a complete design specification for a revised control ring support structure developed from the same differential torque distribution principle as the brace, but applied to a permanent housing geometry that eliminated the asymmetric thermal expansion interface entirely, reducing both the ring displacement risk and the total system vibration loading at full capacity. The investigator's engineering consultant reviewed the specification during the session's recess and returned with the assessment that the underlying principle was technically sound, that the proposed geometry was consistent with established practice for thermally asymmetric bearing assemblies, and that the projected reduction in vibration-related maintenance loading across the operational life of the contract represented a cost-benefit of meaningful scale. Lena produced the design files with their original timestamps, showing that Caleb had developed the permanent housing concept in parallel with the temporary brace solution over the same 4-month period, and that his development predated the design revision note Bryce had filed under his own credentials, the note that had incorporated the torsional stress concept without attribution. Bryce's attorney had no productive response to the timestamp record. Grant's attempt to concentrate all accountability on Bryce ran directly into the email archive showing that Grant had been notified of the schedule-driven rationale for the decision and had approved the timeline without requesting any review of the safety data underlying it. The board voted to end the involvement of both Bryce Halden and Grant Sloan with the Ashcroft program on grounds of concealment of material safety information, manipulation of operational monitoring data, and misrepresentation of technical findings to company leadership and to a contracting party. Victoria addressed the room before the session closed and said, without performing it, that she had been in possession of the information required to make a different decision and had not sought it because she had trusted the framing of the people closest to the program instead of examining the evidence those people had chosen not to surface, and that this was a failure of her oversight. She was not in a position to correct retroactively. She turned directly to Caleb and told him that he had been denied the standing to speak in a situation where his speaking was the correct outcome, and that she was responsible for this. Caleb accepted what she said without allowing it to become the kind of public moment that would be useful primarily as a communication strategy. He made 3 requests before the session concluded: that field technicians across the program be granted direct reporting access to the safety board without requiring engineering director approval, that contributor names be made permanent and uneditable in all technical records from the moment of submission, and that raw test data be archived in a system with administrative controls independent from the program director's access. Conrad said, from the end of the table, that if Ashcroft implemented those provisions, Blackwell Gridworks would execute the final contract documents. Victoria agreed. The agreement was signed. Victoria delivered the offer of the Field Reliability Director position in a letter she wrote herself 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, and the role it described was designed to fill a structural absence that the incident had made impossible to pretend was not there. A mechanism connecting the people who built the systems to the people who operated and maintained them in conditions no simulation was designed to replicate. The position carried full engineering standing, participation in every design review from the earliest concept stage, and the authority to require a formal safety pause if field observation data indicated a risk the design record had not captured. Caleb read the letter twice and set it on his desk without responding that day. He submitted 2 conditions before accepting: that Lena Whitaker be appointed to lead the independent verification function with a reporting line bypassing the program director and connecting directly to the board's safety committee, and that the technicians who had been classified as non-contributing support staff across the program be incorporated as standing members of the design review panels. Victoria confirmed both conditions in writing within 2 days. The first training session under the revised safety protocol was held in the same conference room where Caleb had been told to take his garage hardware off the table, and he placed the 3 original bolts at the center of the table at the start of the session without explaining why. He asked each engineer present to describe why the torque values at the 3 installation positions were different from one another. The room produced several answers that were wrong in different ways, and when someone finally worked through the thermal asymmetry correctly, Caleb confirmed it and moved forward, and the experience of arriving at the right answer did not feel like a lesson administered to people who deserved to receive one. Conrad visited the production facility during the early months of the contract's execution phase and spent time in the verification room where the new housing design had been incorporated into the standard assembly documentation, and he noticed 3 bolts mounted in a small display case near the entrance and asked a technician what they represented. The technician explained briefly. Conrad mentioned the case to Caleb at the end of the visit, and Caleb had it removed the following morning and asked the facilities team to replace it with a small framed placard that read, "No warning is too small to be heard." The engineers who had exchanged a look across the conference room table attended the next design review and asked questions about vibration signature interpretation and thermal asymmetry they would not have known to ask several months earlier, and no one in the room mentioned what had previously happened there because the more important fact was that the room itself had changed. Who was required to be in it, what they were required to bring, and what happened to the information they provided. The Aegis H9 production units completed their extended validation cycle without incident across several months, accumulating operational hours under sustained thermal load that exceeded the simulation projections, and the first installation in the Blackwell Gridworks network was commissioned on schedule and performed within every parameter specified in the contract. Ashcroft Dynamics retained its workforce and, more gradually, its standing in the sector. Not because the demonstration had gone as planned, but because the company's response to the point where it had not demonstrated, under pressure and in front of the people with the most to lose, a capacity for honesty that had not been visible when honesty would have been easier. Caleb ended his shifts at the scheduled time, rather than staying to receive acknowledgments, drove home to the house where Avery was finishing her junior year, and on the evening the first Blackwell unit went. Live told her only that the new installation had gone well. She had seen his name referenced in a trade publication and asked about it, and he said he had worked through a problem that needed to be worked through, and that the more significant result was a change in how the organization handled problems going forward, and she nodded with the careful skepticism of someone who suspected she was being given a simplified version of something larger and had decided to accept it anyway. At the facility, a technician 14 months into his first posting flagged an abnormal temperature reading in a valve assembly on one of the new units and brought it to the engineering team's attention in the form of a written observation with measurements attached, and the design team did not dismiss it. They stopped the inspection process, asked the technician to walk them through what he had observed, and scheduled a physical review for the following morning without requiring any further justification. Caleb saw the meeting notice in his inbox and did not attend. The process was doing what it was supposed to do, and his presence was not what the process needed. He had 3 bolts in the top drawer of his desk, scuffed from use, ordinary in every visible way, the same 3 he had carried into a room full of people who were certain that confidence and credentials were the same thing. Those people had laughed when he set them on the table. Not one of them was laughing anymore,